Sometimes the most terrifying stories don't start with blood or any kind of violence. They start with a normal routine, a usual phone call, a familiar road, the sound of a car engine humming in the dark. And that's where this one begins. Nearly 17 years ago, in India's national capital, on a deserted road. Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. I'm Dr. D. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe. So let's start with chapter 1 of this story, and I'd like to call this one 10 Minutes from Home. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was September 30th of 2008, and New Delhi was asleep, or at least was pretending to be asleep. A 25-year-old journalist, Soumya Vishwanathan, had just wrapped up her shift at her news office in central Delhi's Jhandewalan. She was heading home to Vasant Kunj, a drive she had taken countless times before. It was 3:17 a.m. and she did what she's always done. She called her father. It was a quick sort of ritual that they had where she was informing her family that she was leaving now. It would be the last time her father would ever hear her voice. By 3:45 a.m., hardly 30 minutes later, someone found her car. It had veered off on the road on the Nelson Mandela Marg. A restaurant worker was on a bicycle and he saw her slumped over, motionless. The police was called and they rushed her to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. But alas, it was too late. She was declared dead on arrival. In the days and months that followed this death, Delhi's press circles were completely stunned. One of their own, a young journalist, had been murdered in cold blood. But what about the Delhi police? What were they doing? Well, they had no leads, no suspects, no motive. So, who was Soumya Vishwanathan? Soumya Vishwanathan was born in the year 1982 to her father M.K. Vishwanathan and her mother Madhvi Vishwanathan, who was a college lecturer. They named her Soumya because Soumya means the gentle one. She grew up in New Delhi, and when it was time for college, she took the tough decision to take an extremely hard entrance exam, which was the entrance exam for the All India Institute of Mass Communication. It was a coveted spot many had aspired to, and she cleared the exam. So she was placed in the Odisha campus of the All India Institute of Mass Communications, and she graduated with honors in the year 2003. Soumya headed straight back from Odisha back to Delhi, where she began her career as a journalist, just as the city was seeing a boom in media. It was the early 2000s, of course, and Hindi, English, regional news channels had a media revolution. And Soumya, of course, thrived. She was a producer, she was a storyteller, and now she was a victim. At this point of the story, you might be thinking, well, Soumya was a journalist. Was she working on something extremely dangerous? Was she following a politician? But hold that thought, because 6 months later, this case takes a chilling turn. Now, let me introduce you to the second woman who was victimized. On the night of March 18th of 2009, another woman vanished. Her name was Jigisha Ghosh, and she was 28 years old. She too lived quite close to Vasant Kunj. She lived in Vasant Vihar, which is just a stone's throw away from where Soumya lived. Jigisha was an operations manager at Hewitt Associates, a corporate job in Noida. She had worked so hard and raced through the ranks, get that coveted position. That night at 4 a.m., her office cab had dropped her off, and she was dropped off right underneath her house. She was finishing a presentation for a US based client, and that meant that on this one off day, this particular day, she was going to arrive home really late. She too called up her mother and said, I'll be home shortly. And she also made a teeny tiny request. She told her mom, quote, make breakfast, I'll be home in a few minutes, unquote. However, Jigisha Ghosh never made it upstairs. Her house was not in a gated complex, you see. This was like a DDA flat. The entrance was open to the road, and after the cab dropped her off, Jigisha took a phone call from a coworker. She had offered to help him on a particular project, and just to speak with him, she had stayed outside talking a little after the cab had dropped him. And then her parents waited and waited, and minutes passed, and then the panic set in. They began calling all co workers. They walked the length and breadth of that road looking for Jigisha. They called up everyone. They asked everyone, "Have you heard from Jigisha?" They called the cab company. And the cab company kept insisting she was dropped right underneath the house. But nobody had seen her ever since. Jigisha was the only child of her parents, Sabita Ghosh and father Jagannath Ghosh. They were instantly horrified and on the alarm. They rushed to the police station. And what do you think the police officers would say? They said she had probably run off with someone. Of course, what else will they say, right? It's a line that's echoed through all crime stories all over the world. There was no urgency in their voice, there was no FIR lodged. That's when Sabita Ghosh pulled every single string that she could think of, and she found an exceptionally distant connection through some relative who knew Somnath Chatterjee, the then Speaker of the Indian Parliament. And it took that personal phone call from Somnath Chatterjee, which at least lit some sort of fire under the Delhi police's backside, that they finally filed an FIR, which is the first information report. However, 2 days later, the worst had already happened. Jigisha's body was discovered in the bushes along the Surajkund Faridabad road. She had been strangled, although some reports do mention that she had been shot with a gun. And the story doesn't end here. It unfortunately gets even darker. Both sets of parents were now waiting for the Delhi police to do something, and Delhi was on high alert. However, Jigisha's parents refused to just sit there and wait. They logged into her bank accounts and they found somewhat of a trail. Over 1.5 lakh rupees, which is roughly around $1,600, had been withdrawn from her account. Her debit card had been used to buy sneakers, watches, and other luxury goods in the Sarojini Nagar area of South Delhi. They took this information to the bank manager and begged him to help. And seeing the plight of these poor old parents, the bank manager finally relented and told them the location of the exact place where these things had been bought. Sabita and Jagannath then made a beeline for that store and started chasing leads themselves. They found the shop where the purchases were made, and suddenly, a glimmer of hope. They could see that there was a CCTV camera right there. And what's even better is that they asked to see the signatures on the receipt that was used while Jigisha's debit card was used. And wouldn't you know it, there it was. Her signature was written vertically, not horizontally. Then the shopkeeper described the buyers, and he did say that it was a group of young men and no woman was accompanying them. And in the CCTV footage was something that could break the whole case open. But of course, the shopkeeper wouldn't let the parents see the CCTV footage. So the Ghoshes, they run to the police station and they beg the police to come over and collect the CCTV footage before it vanishes forever. The police finally took this seriously and rushed to the shop, and this is what they saw on the CCTV footage. They saw that a man was holding a police style radio. They could also see that the same guy was wearing an extremely distinctive cap, and there was a third muscular guy who had a tattoo on his left arm. So the police decides to hit all the gyms in South Delhi. And this actually is quite smart because not everybody can make a buff body like that just sitting at home. So this was some sort of progress. Soon, they were able to gather through their networks that the description that they had been describing to their informants, to some of those informants, sounded like a person they all knew as Poppy. The real name of this person turned out to be Baljit Singh, and he used to train at a particular gym in Masoodpur village, which was actually quite close to Vasant Kunj. And he was not alone. With the help of informants, police soon identified that this man is often seen driving a Hyundai Santro with the license plate HR18C 3409. And as soon as the police gets this information, they decide to barricade certain parts of South Delhi. And right then and there, they briefly stop exactly the car that they're looking for. And once they did, they found not only Baljit Malik, who called himself Poppy, not only did they find the co-accused Amit Shukla, they also find the third co-accused, Ravi Kapoor. And they found a gold mine of other evidence. They found several of Jigisha's belongings. And they also find a country-made pistol. This was all the evidence they needed to charge these men with both robbery and Jigisha's murder. One of them already had an extensive police record. He had previously been impersonating different people in power. He was once caught impersonating a judge. Once he was pretending to be a cop. Another time, he was found to be impersonating a doctor. In short, this man was a serial fraudster. But one of the suspects quickly confessed something even more sinister. And this took the investigation on a full circle. One of these people, during the confession, says that in fact they had killed Soumya Vishwanathan.
Of course, security issues taking their toll on the IPL, and security concerns are perhaps topmost in the minds of most working women in the capital.
The Delhi police today claim to have cracked the murders of two young women, both killed while returning from work in the early hours of the morning. Soumya and Jigisha's killers are in jail, and their grieving parents say the guilty should hang.
Siddharth Pandey has the story.
मैं ये चाहती हूँ मुझे हम पेरेंट्स का वो ओनली चाइल्ड थी, वो छोड़कर हमारा और कोई नहीं था. मेरी बेटी को ऐसा तड़प कर जैसे मरा है, उस लड़के लोगों को फांसी होना चाहिए. मैं फांसी छोड़कर और कुछ नहीं चाहता, और जल्दी से जितना जल्दी से जल्दी हो उसका फांसी हो, नहीं तो मैं जिंदा नहीं रहूंगी मेरी बेटी को इतना.
A mother's demand to get justice for her 24-year-old daughter. Jigisha was killed after she was kidnapped from outside her home last week.
For 20 minutes, Jigisha stood outside her house over here, chatting over the phone with a colleague. That is when a Santro pulled up and the men inside it kidnapped Jigisha.
They may have got some help.
And only today I came to know that the guard of this area, private guard, who is appointed by this Residents Welfare Society, there is a doubt of these police persons that he was the informer, that whenever the girl, whichever the girl comes at what hours, it may come to light after some time.
Inside this car, Jigisha struggled. She was reportedly beaten up, forced to reveal her ATM codes. They then withdrew money from 2 ATMs and also then headed to Faridabad. On the way, they strangled Jigisha and threw her body on the road. Hours later, as soon as shops opened, the alleged killers bought Reebok shoes and an LCD with Jigisha's money. The police tracked down the 4 men, known criminals who have a history of carjacking, young men between ages of 25 to 30. Ravi Kapoor, Amit Shukla, Baljit and Ajay Kumar were identified through CCTV footage at the Sarojini Nagar market where they shopped. Ironically, it took Jigisha's death to solve the murder of Soumya. The arrested men, the police claim, confessed to the killing of Soumya Vishwanathan. The police have since then recovered the gun used to kill the young TV producer. But what is scary is the other material recovered. Fake press ID cards, police uniforms and revolvers were found with them.
They are dragon rights, they are all sort of implements to burgle cars and to burst into houses. So that gang which was well organized to commit crimes.
Soumya was shot dead in a car in September, just a few kilometers from where Jigisha was kidnapped. She too was killed in an attempted robbery. The killers apparently tried to overtake and stop her car. When she didn't do so, they got angry. Completely drunk, they first hit her car and then shot her. Nothing was stolen, however, from Soumya. For her parents, finally, some sense of closure. But many feel that there may still be many unanswered questions. Why was nothing stolen from Soumya, especially since the main motive was robbery? Why did they commit two similar crimes in the same area? If the men arrested have a history of crime, why were they so careless with the use of stolen ATM and credit cards? With Tonima Biswas and Poonam Agarwal, Siddharth Pandey for NDTV.
And here's what happened on the night of 30th of September of 2008. Soumya, as you remember, was driving home that night in the wee hours of the morning, and the road was completely empty. She tried to overtake a particular car because the road was completely empty, ladies and gentlemen. Why wouldn't you? And the minute she did that, this triggered all three of these men who were in that car. They shout at her to stop, and of course, she doesn't. And why would she? She, in fact, hastened her pace and drove on. And then one of these three men fired through the glass and shot Soumya in the temple. Her car immediately hits the divider and she's killed instantly. When her parents finally know this information, that's the little mercy they have in this whole thing, that she died instantaneously. They then drive off and return after a few minutes to see what had actually happened to Soumya. By this time, you remember, the restaurant worker who was on his bicycle had chanced upon Soumya's body, and he had in fact called the police. So by this time, all these men had to do was flee the scene, and that's exactly what these cowards did. With Jigisha, they had a more calculated ploy, unlike what they had in Soumya's case. In Jigisha's case, they asked Jigisha for instructions when she was standing underneath her house on that phone call, helping out a colleague at 4 o'clock in the morning. They hold out a particular piece of paper, and it seems like something scribbled on it, and Jigisha leans in to help these men identify a particular address in her vicinity. And that's when they pull her into the car. They rob her and they drive her around for hours. And then, of course, they feared that she will identify them. And when she knew what they're going to do with her, she made a chilling plea for her life. Jigisha begged and said, quote, "If you kill me, it will kill my mother too," unquote. Of course, these three cold-blooded killers didn't care. They killed her. And then they dumped her body in Faridabad. For years, both these families, Soumya's and Jigisha's, fought an uphill battle in the court system. And what they endured were delays after delays, threats after threats, and harassment after harassment. And this was despite the fact that after their confessions and after the evidence was found, all three of them were in fact in jail. In 2023, however, more than a decade after the killings of both Soumya and Jigisha, these 5 men were in fact convicted. Their names were Ravi Kapoor, Amit Shukla, Baljeet, who called himself Poppy, Baljeet Malik, Ajay Kumar, and another man called Ajay Sethi. They were booked under Section 302 of the Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, because this wasn't just a random act, ladies and gentlemen. These people were an organized crime syndicate. When they finally went to the courts in 2023, they were ordered to pay a mere 1.2 lakh rupees as compensation to Jigisha's family.
It's a relief it has happened. It's a relief. That's all. At least this will be a deterrent to others. I won't say I'm happy because it's not going to bring back my daughter. It's a relief. 15 years is a very long period. And I hope it ends here. We don't have to go through all this again. I hope we don't have to.
रेयरेस्ट ऑफ रेयर इसको नहीं माना गया और जो डेथ पेनल्टी थी उसको देके लाइफ ट्रीटमेंट दिया कहीं डिसअपॉइंट
Death is an easy way out. I never wanted death penalty. I want them to suffer like I am suffering, like we are suffering, away from their family.
But the real cost was Soumya and Jigisha's lives and the peace of mind of both sets of parents. What had in fact been stolen was the futures of all these people. Soumya's father, M.K. Vishwanathan, passed just 2 weeks after he finally heard the verdict. Okay, now let's try to understand how the tragic killings of Jigisha Ghosh and Soumya Vishwanathan can be understood from a criminological standpoint. From the criminological standpoint, this can be understood through Cohen and Felson's routine activities theory. So the routine activities theory, if you've been with me through these episodes, you know that this happens quite often, and I use this theory quite often to explain crimes. It would be that you need the holy trifecta for any crime to occur. So the holy trifecta is you need a motivated offender, which Baljit Kaur and his associates were, Baljit Malik, Poppy, and his associates were all very motivated offenders. You need a suitable target. Individually, Soumya and Jigisha were suitable targets, and you need the absence of capable guardians. As you know, these two women were out doing their routine work, returning super late, almost in the wee hours of the morning. And both women were out alone. They were working late. They were traveling in not the most deserted areas of Delhi, frankly, but the fact that nobody would be there to provide immediate sort of protection to these women. Not that we need grown women to be protected anywhere, but unfortunately, the reality of most countries is we do need even adult women to be protected because there are always motivated offenders around us. So they were out doing their work. However, that very work and returning at these timings basically made them vulnerable targets for opportunistic offenders who were roaming around and who were just looking for suitable victims. It just happened to be the case that Jigisha was there, and it just happens to be the case that Soumya was there that night. Had it not been the two of these, maybe it would have been some other people that we would be covering. However, that is routine activities theory. Now, of course, Cornish and Clark's rational choice theory applies here as well, because this theory posits that criminals weigh the cost and benefit analysis. It runs through their mind every time they do any kind of crime. To us, of course, it looks completely senseless. Why would anybody do that is what we would think. But these were targeted, this crime syndicate, 5 or so people were targeting women in isolated areas during isolated times. They were planning their escape route because they all lived in South Delhi, by the way. So that's where they worked and operated, and that's where they lived. And they stole debit cards and they attempted to get material benefits from these killings as well. And that is actually seems to be the only motivation here for both the crimes. So this rationally to them works for them. For the rest of us, this sounds so stupid that they would do something like this. But they had learned, because they'd been a crime syndicate for a while, and they had been committing crimes their entire life, and they would never have enough repercussions for their behavior. So why wouldn't they learn from it? And they would see abducting women and taking their money and their possessions as a low risk crime. So to them, it makes perfect sense. So for them, it was a rational choice. And of course, something that I just touched upon is they were habitual offenders. So social learning theory applies here, which is Bandura's theory from 1977. It works everywhere, which is crime is a learned behavior. If you are a person who has not been committing crime yourself, but you're associated and surrounded by people who commit crime, you perceive this as an acceptable thing to do, and more or less, you would also turn into people like those that you surround yourself with. That's not always the case, but that's generally the case. So these men operated as a mini crime syndicate. Their behavior was reinforced by each other. They were all habitual offenders. They loved impersonating people in power. They had pretended to be doctors, judges, police officers, and so on and so forth. So works well for these kind of people, and they learn that they can always get away. Now, there is one really interesting theory which can sort of apply here, which is the subculture of violence theory. And here it applies because there are some environments in certain places which sort of become breeding grounds for aggressive personalities and violent tendencies. And this is how these people sort of get together. So, this gang like behavior of extreme violence includes the unnecessary killing of both Soumya and Jigisha. And this emerges because it reflects these people's toxic subculture where they glorify dominance and fear and their sense of bravado. So their machismo lies in killing two helpless women who were basically out and about living their perfect lives, making more money than these men would ever make. And these kind of men prey on people like that and victims like that and to women like that. So that brings us to somewhat of an understanding of why such crimes happen. That brings us to the end of this episode of Collectively Vigilant. As you know, this episode is also available in a podcast form, but will not be identical because I host that with Sam, who's the psychologist. So if you want to tune into that, I will put a link in the description box. It's available on both Apple and Spotify. So this brings us to the end of our story for today. But we can continue to give this family so much more than our thoughts and prayers. We can give these two families and so many families like this our collective vigilance so that people like Poppy, people like Shukla, and people like Kapoor do not get out of jail scot-free and are not released early into our public spaces. So, until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.